April 4th, 1988. Good Friday afternoon in Fort Wayne, Indiana. 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley waves goodbye to her friend and skips home from their neighborhood playground. She's excited about Easter Sunday, just 3 days away. Her mother expects her home any moment, but April never makes it. 3 days later, on Easter Sunday, a jogger finds her body in a ditch 20 miles away in rural DeKalb County. She has been sexually assaulted and murdered. The killer vanishes without a trace, leaving behind only his DNA and the devastated Tinsley family. For most cold cases, that would be the end of the story. The killer would disappear into anonymity, protected by time and the limitations of 1988 forensic technology. But April Tinsley's killer was different. He was arrogant, he was compulsive, and most importantly, he couldn't resist taunting the police and terrorizing the community with messages that would span 16 years and ultimately lead to his downfall. What started as a child murder in 1988 became a psychological campaign of terror that wouldn't end until 2004, when the killer made his final, fatal mistake. The messages began in 1990, 2 years after April's murder. Someone painted a chilling message on the side of a barn in rural Indiana. "I kill 8-year-old April M. Tinsley. Did you find her other shoe? Haha, I will kill again." The misspelling of "again" would become part of the killer's signature, along with his disturbing habit of mentioning April's missing shoe. For 14 more years, the killer would leave messages, make phone calls, and distribute disturbing packages throughout Fort Wayne, always taunting investigators and claiming credit for April's murder. The taunting reached its peak in 2004, when the killer began leaving packages on young girls' bicycles throughout Fort Wayne. The packages contained used condoms with his DNA, Polaroid photographs of his own body, and handwritten notes threatening new victims. "Hi honey, I've been watching you. I am the same person that kidnapped, raped, and killed April Tinsley. You are my next victim." It was these final taunts that would provide investigators with fresh DNA evidence and renewed determination to solve April's case. For 30 years, investigators had the killer's DNA profile, but no one to match it to. They had analyzed thousands of potential suspects, followed countless leads, and even had the killer's own admission of guilt in his taunting messages. But traditional forensic methods hit a wall when the perpetrator wasn't in any criminal database. Then in April 2018, just weeks after the Golden State Killer was captured using genetic genealogy, Fort Wayne investigators decided to try the revolutionary new technique on April's case. What happened next demonstrated the incredible power of genetic genealogy when applied to cases with good DNA evidence and cooperative databases. Within 6 weeks, genealogist C.C. Moore had built the family trees and identified the suspect. When Fort Wayne police knocked on 59-year-old John D. Miller's door on July 15, 2018, he opened it and said just one word: April Tinsley. The man who had taunted investigators for 16 years, who had terrorized a community with his threats and boasts, was captured by the very DNA evidence he had been arrogantly leaving behind for decades. Before we examine how a killer's own arrogance led to his downfall, and how genetic genealogy solved a 30-year-old case in just 6 weeks, make sure you're subscribed to the Investigation Room and hit that notification bell right now. Here at the Investigation Room, we investigate cases where advancing science and new techniques are finally bringing justice to victims who deserved answers decades ago. The April Tinsley case shows how genetic genealogy can work when everything comes together perfectly: good DNA evidence, cooperative databases, and a perpetrator whose own compulsive behavior provided investigators with exactly what they needed to catch him. New comprehensive investigations every week, exploring how cases that seemed impossible to solve are finally being closed through revolutionary forensic techniques. Drop a like if you believe that killers who taunt law enforcement deserve to be caught by their own evidence. And let me know in the comments what you think about cases where criminals become so arrogant that they literally provide the evidence needed for their own capture. Because what we're about to reveal about April Tinsley's case will show you how genetic genealogy is revolutionizing cold case investigation and why no killer can hide forever when science advances enough to reach back across decades. April Marie Tinsley was born on March 18, 1980, to Janet Tinsley, a young single mother who was working hard to provide for her daughter in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Janet was just 20 years old when April was born, and she was determined to give her daughter the best life possible, despite the challenges of being a single parent. April was described by everyone who knew her as a bright, energetic child with a beautiful smile and an infectious laugh that could light up any room. She loved to play outside, ride her bicycle, and spend time with friends in their Fort Wayne neighborhood. The Tinsley family lived in a modest home on Hoagland Avenue, in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Fort Wayne. It was the kind of community where children played freely in yards and streets, where neighbors knew each other's names, and where parents felt comfortable letting their kids explore the neighborhood with the kind of independence that was common in the 1980s. The area was considered safe, with tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and families who had lived there for generations. Janet Tinsley worked multiple jobs to support herself and April, including positions at local restaurants and retail stores. She was devoted to her daughter and made significant sacrifices to ensure that April had everything she needed. Despite the financial challenges of single parenthood, Janet made sure that April was well-dressed, well-fed, and surrounded by love. The two of them shared an especially close bond, spending evenings together watching television, reading books, and talking about April's day at school. April was known throughout the neighborhood as a friendly, outgoing child who got along well with both adults and other children. She had a natural curiosity about the world around her and was always asking questions about how things worked or why things happened the way they did. Her neighbors remembered her as a polite little girl who would wave to them from her bicycle and always had a cheerful greeting when she encountered them during her neighborhood adventures. At Fairfield Elementary School, April was a popular second grader who enjoyed learning and had many friends among her classmates. Her teachers described her as an eager student who participated actively in class discussions and always tried her best on assignments. She was particularly fond of art class and loved to create colorful drawings that she would proudly bring home to show her mother. April was also excited about learning to read more difficult books and often spent time at the school library, checking out stories about animals and adventures. April's best friend was Amy Garrett, who lived several blocks away but attended the same school and spent considerable time playing with April, both at school and in their neighborhood. The two girls enjoyed typical childhood activities like riding bicycles, playing with dolls, and creating elaborate imaginary games that could occupy them for hours at a time. Amy's family had gotten to know April well through her frequent visits to their home, and they considered her to be like part of their own family. The spring of 1988 was an exciting time for April, who was looking forward to Easter Sunday and all the celebrations that came with the holiday. She had been talking for weeks about the Easter Bunny, Easter egg hunts, and the special dinner that her family was planning. April loved holidays and celebrations of all kinds. But Easter was particularly special to her because it meant that winter was finally over and she would be able to spend more time playing outside in the warm weather that she loved so much. April was also excited about the prospect of summer vacation, which was only a few months away. She had been making plans with Amy and other friends about all the things they wanted to do during the long summer days, including swimming, riding bicycles, and exploring the parks and wooded areas around their neighborhood. April was the kind of child who found joy in simple pleasures and who looked forward to each new day with enthusiasm and optimism. On Friday, April 4th, 1988, the weather in Fort Wayne was unusually warm for early spring, with temperatures reaching into the 60s and bright sunshine that made it feel like summer was just around the corner. April had been excited all day about the prospect of playing outside and had asked her mother that morning if she could visit Amy after school. Janet had agreed, as she had many times before, knowing that April was responsible and that the Garrett family would keep an eye on her. April had walked to Amy's house countless times over the previous months, and the route had become as familiar to her as walking around her own backyard. The distance was less than half a mile, mostly along residential streets where April knew many of the residents and felt completely safe. She had never encountered any problems during these walks and had never reported any incidents that made her feel uncomfortable or unsafe. The Garrett family welcomed April warmly that Friday afternoon, and she spent several hours playing with Amy and enjoying the beautiful spring weather in their backyard. Mrs. Garrett later recalled that April seemed particularly happy and excited that day, talking about Easter plans and all the fun things she wanted to do over the weekend. April helped Amy's mother with some small household tasks and was as polite and well-behaved as always during her visit. Around 3 p.m., April told the Garrett family that she needed to head home to help her mother with dinner preparations and to get ready for the evening activities that the family had planned. She hugged Amy goodbye and thanked Mrs. Garrett for letting her visit, displaying the kind of good manners that her mother had taught her and that made her welcome in neighbors' homes throughout the area. April left the Garrett house in high spirits, looking forward to seeing her mother and sharing stories about her afternoon with Amy. She was carrying a small backpack with some toys and began the familiar walk home through streets that she had traveled many times before. The neighborhood was quiet that afternoon, with most children still in school and most adults either at work or inside their homes preparing for the evening. The route from Amy's house to April's home took her through several residential blocks, past houses where she recognized many of the residents, and through areas where she had played and explored many times before. It was a route that should have been completely safe for an 8-year-old child who was familiar with the neighborhood and who was expected home by a specific time. April was a responsible child who always followed her mother's instructions about coming home when she was supposed to, and she had never been late without calling to explain her delay. But somewhere along that familiar route, on the afternoon of April 4th, 1988, something went terribly wrong. April encountered someone who would change her life and the life of her family forever, someone who would take her away from the safe neighborhood she loved and would set in motion a chain of events that would terrorize the Fort Wayne community for the next 16 years. The details of exactly what happened during those critical minutes may never be fully known, but the impact of April's disappearance would be felt by everyone who knew her and by many who had never met her, but who would come to know her story through the tragic events that followed. April spent the afternoon playing with Amy at the Garrett house, enjoying the warm spring weather and the excitement of the upcoming Easter holiday. Around 3 p.m., April decided it was time to head home to her mother. She said goodbye to Amy and her family and began the short walk home through the familiar streets of their neighborhood. The distance from Amy's house to April's home was less than half a mile, a walk that should have taken April no more than 10 or 15 minutes. She was an experienced walker who knew the route well and had never had any problems before, but April Tinsley never made it home. Somewhere between Amy Garrett's house and her own front door, 8-year-old April encountered the person who would take her life and terrorize her community for the next 16 years. When April didn't arrive home by dinner time, Janet Tinsley knew immediately that something was wrong. April was a responsible child who always came home when she was expected, and she would never have stayed away without calling or getting permission. Janet began calling friends and neighbors, looking for April and hoping for a simple explanation for her absence. When it became clear that no one had seen April since she left Amy's house that afternoon, Janet called the Fort Wayne Police Department to report her daughter missing. The police responded quickly, recognizing the serious nature of a missing 8-year-old girl. They began canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing residents, and searching for any sign of April or evidence of what might have happened to her. The search continued through the night and into the next day, with volunteers joining law enforcement officers in combing through parks, vacant lots, and wooded areas. The discovery came on Easter Sunday, April 7th, 1988, when a jogger found April's body in a drainage ditch along County Road, 68 inches, rural DeKalb County, about 20 miles northeast of Fort Wayne. The location was remote and would have been familiar only to someone who knew the area well. April had been sexually assaulted and killed, and her body had been left in a location where the killer clearly hoped it would never be found. Only one of April's shoes was discovered with her body. The other remained missing, a detail that would become significant years later when the killer began his taunting campaign. The crime scene investigation revealed that April had been killed elsewhere and her body transported to the dump site. Investigators collected physical evidence, including DNA evidence that would prove crucial to the case 3 decades later. However, in 1988, DNA technology was still in its infancy, and the evidence could not be analyzed in ways that would be useful for identification purposes. The evidence was carefully preserved, waiting for technology to advance enough to unlock its secrets. When April didn't arrive home by dinner time on April 4th, 1988, Janet Tinsley knew immediately that something was wrong. April was an extremely responsible child who had never been late without calling or getting permission to stay longer at a friend's house. Janet had taught April to always let her know where she was and when she would be home, and April had never failed to follow these basic safety rules that were so important to a single mother trying to keep her daughter safe. Janet began calling friends and neighbors, starting with the Garrett family to confirm when April had left their house. When Mrs. Garrett told her that April had left around 3 p.m. for the short walk home, Janet became increasingly concerned. The walk should have taken no more than 15 minutes, which meant that April should have been home by 3:30 p.m. at the latest. By 6 p.m., when April still hadn't appeared, Janet knew that something terrible had happened to her daughter. Janet called the Fort Wayne Police Department to report April missing, and the police responded with the urgency that a missing child case deserved. Officers arrived at the Tinsley home within minutes of the call and immediately began gathering information about April's disappearance. They interviewed Janet extensively about April's habits, her friends, and any recent changes in her behavior that might provide clues about what had happened to her. The police also immediately began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors to ask residents if they had seen April that afternoon, or if they had noticed anything unusual or suspicious in the area. The response from the community was immediate and overwhelming, with neighbors volunteering to help search for April and providing any information they could about their interactions with her or observations about the neighborhood. The initial investigation revealed that several neighbors had seen April walking home from Amy's house that afternoon, but no one had witnessed anything unusual or concerning. April had appeared normal and happy as she walked through the neighborhood, waving to people she knew and following her usual route home. However, somewhere along that familiar path, something had gone wrong, and April had simply vanished without anyone seeing what had happened to her. As word of April's disappearance spread throughout the neighborhood and beyond, the community response was extraordinary. Hundreds of volunteers joined the search effort, combing through parks, wooded areas, vacant lots, and any other locations where April might have been taken or where she might have sought shelter if she had become lost or confused. Local businesses donated food and supplies for the searchers, and radio and television stations provided extensive coverage to help spread the word about April's disappearance. The search effort continued through the night of April 4th and throughout the next day, with police officers, firefighters, emergency volunteers, and ordinary citizens all working together to find April. Search dogs were brought in to follow scent trails, and helicopters flew overhead to scan large areas that would have been difficult to search on foot. The effort represented one of the largest search operations in Fort Wayne history, reflecting both the community's love for April and their determination to find her safely. However, as the hours passed without any sign of April, the mood of the search began to change, from hopeful to increasingly desperate. Experienced law enforcement officers knew that the first 24 to 48 hours were critical in missing child cases, and the fact that April had not been found despite such an intensive search effort was a very bad sign. The weather was still relatively cold at night, and if April was somewhere outside and unable to get help, she could be in serious danger, even if she had not been harmed by whoever had taken her. Janet Tinsley was beside herself with worry and fear, unable to eat or sleep as she waited for news about her daughter. The police had advised her to stay home in case April tried to call, or in case anyone contacted the family with information. But sitting and waiting was almost unbearable for a mother whose child was missing. Janet spent the time calling April's name from the front porch, hoping that somehow her daughter would hear her voice and be able to respond. The media coverage of April's disappearance was extensive, with local television stations providing regular updates about the search effort and broadcasting appeals for information from anyone who might have seen April or noticed anything suspicious in the area. The story also attracted attention from regional and national media outlets, as missing child cases always generated significant public interest and concern. The discovery came on Easter Sunday, April 7th, 1988, when a jogger found April's body in a drainage ditch along County Road 68 inches, rural DeKalb County, about 20 miles northeast of Fort Wayne. The location was remote and rural, accessible by dirt roads that would have been familiar only to someone who knew the area well or who had specifically scouted the location in advance. The discovery immediately transformed the case from a missing child investigation into a homicide investigation. The crime scene where April's body was found showed clear evidence that she had been sexually assaulted and murdered, and that her body had been transported to the location and dumped there by her killer. The remote location suggested that the perpetrator was familiar with the area and had chosen it specifically because it was unlikely to be discovered quickly. Only one of April's shoes was found with her body, a detail that would become significant years later when the killer began his taunting campaign. The news of April's death devastated her family, friends, and the entire Fort Wayne community. What had begun as a hopeful search for a missing child had ended in the worst possible way, and the realization that April had been murdered by a stranger shattered the sense of safety and security that had characterized their neighborhood. Parents throughout the area began taking new precautions to protect their children, and the carefree atmosphere that had allowed children to play freely in the neighborhood was permanently changed. The crime scene investigation was conducted by experienced detectives and forensic specialists who carefully documented every aspect of the scene and collected all available physical evidence. This included biological evidence that would later prove crucial to the case, though in 1988, DNA technology was still in its early stages and could not be analyzed in ways that would be useful for identification purposes. The evidence was carefully preserved, waiting for technology to advance enough to unlock its secrets. The investigation immediately became one of the highest priorities for the Fort Wayne Police Department and other law enforcement agencies in the region. Every available detective was assigned to work on the case, and investigators from surrounding counties offered their assistance and expertise. The FBI was also consulted for their expertise in crimes against children and for their access to behavioral analysis resources that might help identify the type of person who would commit such a crime. The investigation faced significant challenges from the beginning, primarily due to the lack of witnesses to April's abduction. The time of day when April had disappeared meant that most people were either at work or inside their homes, and the route she had taken passed through areas where there were few opportunities for casual observation. Additionally, the remote location where April's body had been found provided few clues about how the killer had become familiar with the area or why he had chosen that particular location. Investigators interviewed hundreds of people in their efforts to identify April's killer, including registered sex offenders, people who had been reported acting suspiciously around children, and anyone who had access to children through work or volunteer activities. They also looked at people who had knowledge of the rural area where April's body had been found, including farmers, hunters, and others who might have had reason to be familiar with the remote roads and ditches. However, none of these investigations produced a viable suspect who could be connected to April's murder through evidence or reliable testimony. The killer appeared to be someone who had no prior criminal record, who had not attracted attention from law enforcement, and who was skilled at avoiding detection. This made the case extremely difficult to solve using traditional investigative methods. The community impact of April's murder was profound and lasting. Parents throughout Fort Wayne and the surrounding areas became much more protective of their children, instituting new rules about supervision and limiting their children's independence in ways that would have been unthinkable before April's death. Schools increased their security measures and began teaching children about personal safety in more explicit and urgent ways. The case also generated significant media attention that extended far beyond the Fort Wayne area. Missing and murdered child cases always attracted national attention, and April's case became one of the most well-known unsolved crimes in Indiana. The media coverage kept the case in the public consciousness and maintained pressure on law enforcement to continue their investigation efforts. Local businesses and community organizations established reward funds to encourage anyone with information about April's case to come forward. These rewards eventually totaled tens of thousands of dollars, representing a significant incentive for anyone who might have knowledge about the crime. However, despite the substantial rewards and extensive media coverage, no one came forward with information that led to the identification of April's killer. As months passed without any significant progress in the investigation, the case began to transition from an active investigation to a cold case that was reviewed periodically but lacked new leads to pursue. This was a devastating development for April's family, who had hoped that their daughter's killer would be identified quickly and brought to justice. The lack of progress meant that they had to live with the uncertainty of not knowing who had killed April or whether that person might strike again. Then, in 1990, 2 years after April's murder, something unprecedented happened that would distinguish this case from virtually every other child murder in American criminal history. Someone painted a message on the side of a weathered red barn along U.S. Highway 24 near Huntington, Indiana, about 25 miles from Fort Wayne. The message was written in white paint and read, "I kill 8-year-old April M. Tinsley. Did you find her other shoe? Haha, I will kill again." The misspelling of again as agin would become one of the killer's signatures, along with his disturbing reference to April's missing shoe. The barn message was discovered by a local farmer who immediately recognized its significance and contacted law enforcement. When investigators arrived to examine the message, they were stunned by its implications. The reference to April's missing shoe was a detail that had never been released to the public, meaning that only someone directly involved in the crime would have known about it. The message was clearly designed to terrorize the community and taunt law enforcement officers who were still working to solve April's case. The discovery of the barn message sent shockwaves through the Fort Wayne community and beyond. Parents who had begun to feel slightly more secure as time passed since April's murder were suddenly reminded that her killer was still out there, still thinking about his crime, and apparently still in the area. The message suggested that the killer was not only unrepentant about what he had done, but was actually proud of it and wanted to make sure that no one forgot about his crime. Law enforcement agencies immediately launched an investigation into the barn message, treating it as a direct communication from April's killer. The message was photographed extensively and analyzed for any clues it might provide about the perpetrator's identity or psychology. Investigators also canvassed the area around the barn, looking for anyone who might have seen suspicious activity in the days or weeks before the message was discovered. However, the rural location of the barn made it unlikely that anyone would have witnessed the message being painted. The barn was located on a relatively quiet stretch of highway, and the message could have been painted at night or during times when traffic was minimal. The killer had apparently chosen the location carefully to maximize the visibility of his message while minimizing the risk of being seen while painting it. The psychological impact of the barn message on April's family was devastating. Janet Tinsley, who had begun the difficult process of trying to rebuild her life after losing her daughter, was forced to confront the reality that April's killer was still out there and was actively taunting them about their loss. The message felt like a personal attack on the family, designed to prevent them from finding any peace or closure. The message also had a significant impact on the investigation, as it provided investigators with new evidence to analyze and new hope that the killer might eventually make a mistake that would lead to his identification. The fact that he was still in contact with law enforcement suggested that he might be compulsive enough to continue communicating, potentially providing additional opportunities for investigators to gather evidence or clues about his identity. The barn message marked the beginning of a 16-year campaign of psychological terrorism that would keep April's case in the public consciousness and maintain a climate of fear throughout the Fort Wayne area. The killer seemed to derive satisfaction from the attention his crime received, and from the knowledge that he could terrorize an entire community while remaining anonymous and apparently safe from detection. In 1992, 4 years after April's murder, and 2 years after the barn message, someone called the Allen County Sheriff's Department and claimed responsibility for April's death. The caller spoke in a calm, controlled voice and provided details about the crime that had never been released to the public. He used language and references that matched the barn message, including the same distinctive misspellings and references to April's missing shoe, confirming that the same person was responsible for both communications. The phone call was recorded and analyzed extensively by law enforcement and behavioral experts. The caller's voice was described as that of an adult male who seemed comfortable with the attention he was receiving and confident that he would not be caught. He spoke slowly and deliberately, as if he were enjoying the conversation and wanted to savor the moment. The call lasted several minutes, during which the caller made additional threats against children in the community. The recording of the call was played on local television and radio stations in hopes that someone might recognize the voice, but no one came forward with information that led to the caller's identification. The voice analysis conducted by experts suggested that the caller was likely a local resident who was familiar with the Fort Wayne area and with the details of April's case that had been reported in the media. Additional graffiti messages began appearing sporadically over the years, always with the same distinctive misspellings and references to April's missing shoe. These messages appeared in various locations throughout the Fort Wayne area, including on buildings, bridges, and other structures where they would be seen by large numbers of people. Each message renewed public interest in April's case and reminded the community that her killer was still out there. The pattern of messages suggested that the killer was monitoring media coverage of his communications and was adjusting his tactics based on the response he received. When messages received extensive media attention, he seemed more likely to communicate again in the near future. When periods passed without significant coverage, he would often escalate his communications to regain attention. The messages also revealed important psychological information about the killer that helped investigators develop a behavioral profile. The killer clearly enjoyed the attention and fear that his communications generated, and he seemed to view his relationship with law enforcement and the community as a game that he was winning. This narcissistic behavior pattern suggested that he might eventually become careless or overconfident in ways that could lead to his identification. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, investigators continued to analyze each new communication from April's killer, looking for patterns or clues that might help identify him. They consulted with behavioral experts and criminal profilers who helped them understand the psychological motivations behind the killer's need to maintain contact with law enforcement and terrorize the community. The communications also provided investigators with opportunities to gather new evidence, as each message or call represented a potential source of physical or technological evidence that might lead to the killer's identification. However, the killer seemed to be aware of these risks and took precautions to avoid leaving evidence that could be traced back to him. The killer's campaign of terror reached its peak in 2004, 16 years after April's murder, when he began leaving packages on young girls' bicycles throughout Fort Wayne. These packages represented a significant escalation in both the boldness of his communications and the level of direct threat they contained. The discovery of the first package created panic among parents and renewed urgency in the investigation of April's case. The packages were carefully constructed and contained multiple types of evidence that provided investigators with new leads to pursue. Each package included used condoms containing the killer's DNA, Polaroid photographs of his body, showing his torso and legs, but not his face, and handwritten notes that directly threatened new victims. The notes were written in the same distinctive style as the previous communications, with the same misspellings and references to April's murder. The handwritten notes read, "Hi honey, I've been watching you. I am the same person that kidnapped, raped, and killed April Tinsley. You are my next victim." The notes were clearly designed to terrorize the girls who found them and to create panic throughout the community. The killer was escalating from general taunting to specific threats against identifiable potential victims. The packages were discovered by the girls' families, who immediately contacted police. Each discovery created a new wave of fear and media attention, as parents realized that the person who had killed April Tinsley 16 years earlier was apparently stalking new victims and might be preparing to strike again. The threat was taken seriously by law enforcement, who increased patrols in neighborhoods where packages had been found and warned parents to be especially vigilant about their children's safety. From an investigative standpoint, the 2004 packages were a breakthrough because they provided investigators with multiple types of fresh evidence that could be analyzed using techniques that had advanced significantly since 1988. The DNA extracted from the used condoms could be analyzed using STR technology that provided much more detailed genetic profiles than had been available in the late 1980s. The photographs and handwritten notes could also be analyzed for additional clues about the perpetrator's identity and characteristics. Most importantly, the DNA evidence from the packages matched perfectly with the genetic material that had been recovered from April's crime scene in 1988, definitively confirming that the same person was responsible for both April's murder and the years of taunting that had followed. This connection meant that investigators could be certain they were dealing with April's actual killer, not someone who was claiming responsibility for a crime he hadn't committed. The 2004 packages also revealed important information about the killer's current psychological state and his escalating need for attention and control. The decision to threaten specific new victims suggested that the killer might be losing control of his impulses and might be preparing to commit additional crimes. This possibility made the case an urgent priority for law enforcement agencies throughout the region. However, despite the wealth of new evidence provided by the 2004 packages, investigators still faced the same fundamental problem that had plagued the case since 1988. They had conclusive proof of who had committed the crimes, but they had no way to identify that person using the tools and techniques available to them at the time. The killer's DNA profile was complete and unambiguous, but it didn't match anyone in criminal databases, and traditional investigative methods had failed to identify him despite 16 years of effort. However, even with a complete DNA profile, investigators still couldn't identify April's killer because his DNA was not in any criminal database. The killer had apparently never been arrested for a crime that required DNA collection, or he had committed April's murder before DNA databases were established, and had managed to avoid arrest for any serious crimes in the years since. The DNA evidence proved that investigators had the right person's genetic profile, but it didn't help them determine who that person actually was. The DNA evidence from the 2004 packages was entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, and compared to millions of profiles from convicted criminals across the United States. However, these searches failed to produce any matches, confirming that the killer was not in any law enforcement database. This was frustrating but not entirely surprising, given the killer's apparent ability to avoid detection for 16 years of taunting law enforcement. The investigation continued with traditional methods throughout the 2000s and 2010s, but investigators were essentially stuck with the same problem that had plagued the case since 1988. They had conclusive evidence of who had committed the crime, but they had no way to identify that person using the tools and techniques available to them. The killer's DNA profile was like having a perfect fingerprint of an unknown person, conclusive for identification purposes, but useless without someone to compare it to. The breakthrough came in April 2018, just weeks after the Golden State Killer had been identified using genetic genealogy techniques. Fort Wayne investigators, led by Detective Brian Martin, realized that April Tinsley's case might be perfect for genetic genealogy because it had exactly what the technique required: a high-quality DNA profile from the perpetrator, and a clear, solvable crime that would justify the resources and effort required for genealogical research. Detective Martin had been following the developments in genetic genealogy with great interest, particularly after the success of the Golden State Killer case had demonstrated that the technique could work on high-profile unsolved crimes. Martin recognized that April's case had several advantages that might make it even more suitable for genetic genealogy than the Golden State Killer case had been. The DNA evidence was newer and higher quality. The killer had provided multiple samples through his taunting behavior, and the case had remained in the public consciousness in ways that might help generate support for innovative investigative approaches. The decision to try genetic genealogy on April's case was also influenced by the fact that traditional investigative methods had been thoroughly exhausted over the course of 30 years. Investigators had interviewed thousands of people, followed countless leads, and analyzed every piece of physical evidence using the most advanced techniques available. The DNA profile had been compared to millions of known criminals in CODIS without producing any matches. At this point, genetic genealogy represented the only realistic hope of identifying April's killer. Detective Martin contacted Parabon Nanolabs, one of the genetic genealogy companies that had emerged in the wake of the Golden State Killer success. Parabon specialized in using genetic genealogy to solve cold cases, and had already begun working with law enforcement agencies across the country to identify suspects in unsolved crimes. The company was led by Dr. Ellen Graytack, a geneticist with expertise in DNA analysis, and C.C. Moore, a genealogist with extensive experience in using family tree research to identify unknown persons. Parabon's approach to genetic genealogy was systematic and thorough, involving multiple steps that had been refined through their work on dozens of cases since the Golden State Killer breakthrough. First, they would analyze the quality of the DNA evidence to determine whether it was suitable for genetic genealogy. Then, they would upload the DNA profile to public genealogy databases to search for genetic matches. Finally, they would use those matches to build comprehensive family trees that could potentially lead to the identification of the unknown perpetrator. April Tinsley's case was an ideal candidate for genetic genealogy for several reasons. The DNA evidence was high quality and came from multiple sources, thanks to the killer's own behavior in leaving biological evidence in the 2004 packages. The case was well documented and had been thoroughly investigated, meaning that Parabon would have access to extensive background information that could help guide their genealogical research. Most importantly, the case involved serious crimes that clearly justified the time and resources required for genetic genealogy analysis. Parabon began their analysis by uploading the killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch and other public genealogy databases to search for genetic matches that could be used as starting points for building family trees. The process was similar to what had been used in the Golden State Killer case, but Parabon had the advantage of working with databases that had grown larger and more diverse in the months since that breakthrough case. The initial search results were promising and showed several genetic matches at levels that indicated the unknown killer was related to people in the databases at the level of third or fourth cousins. These matches provided C.C. Moore with starting points for building family trees that could potentially lead to the killer's identification. The genetic matches suggested that the killer's ancestors had lived in the Midwest for several generations, which was consistent with the geographic location of April's murder and the killer's apparent familiarity with the Fort Wayne area. Moore began building comprehensive family trees for each of the genetic matches, working backward through historical records to identify common ancestors, and then forward through time to identify all possible descendants who could be the killer. The process required extensive research using multiple databases and record collections, including birth certificates, marriage records, death certificates, census records, military records, and other historical documents. The genealogical research was facilitated by the fact that many of the families Moore was researching had been in the same geographic area for multiple generations, creating well-documented family trees that were easier to trace than families that had migrated frequently or had incomplete records. The Midwest had particularly good genealogical records for families that had been in the region since the 19th century, and many of the genetic matches came from families with these characteristics. Moore's research revealed that the killer's ancestors had likely immigrated to the Midwest in the mid-1800s and had established themselves in farming and other rural occupations that kept them in the same general area for several generations. This pattern was consistent with what investigators knew about the killer's apparent familiarity with both urban Fort Wayne and the rural areas where April's body had been found. As Moore built out the family trees, she began to identify clusters of potential common ancestors who could have been great-great-grandparents of April Tinsley's killer. These ancestors typically had numerous descendants spread throughout the Midwest, creating large family trees that needed to be analyzed systematically to identify potential suspects who met the basic criteria for being the killer. The process of working forward from common ancestors to identify potential suspects required careful analysis of both genealogical records and investigative criteria. Each potential candidate had to meet several requirements. They had to be male. They had to be the right age to have committed April's murder in 1988. They had to have connections to the Fort Wayne area, and they had to have been able to move freely throughout the area for the 16 years of taunting that followed April's death. Moore collaborated closely with Fort Wayne investigators throughout the genealogical research process, ensuring that potential suspects identified through genetic genealogy were evaluated using investigative criteria that had been developed through 30 years of work on the case. This collaboration was crucial for ensuring that the genealogical research was focused on candidates who were actually viable suspects, rather than just genealogically connected individuals. The research process was also informed by behavioral analysis that had been conducted on the killer over the years. The killer's taunting behavior suggested that he was likely someone who lived or worked in the Fort Wayne area on a long-term basis, who was familiar with local media coverage of the case, and who felt confident enough in his ability to avoid detection that he was willing to risk exposure through his communications. After several weeks of intensive research, Moore had narrowed the possibilities to a handful of potential suspects who met both the genealogical criteria and the investigative profile that had been developed for the killer. Each of these candidates required additional research and background checks to determine which one was most likely to be April's killer. One candidate quickly emerged as the most promising: John D. Miller, a 59-year-old man who lived in Grable, Indiana, a small town just outside Fort Wayne. Miller's age and location matched the profile that investigators had developed for the killer, and his genealogical connection to the genetic matches was strong enough to make him a prime candidate for DNA confirmation. Background investigation of Miller revealed that he had lived in the Fort Wayne area his entire life, and would have been familiar with both the neighborhood where April was abducted and the rural roads where her body was found. He had been 30 years old in 1988, which put him in the right age range to have committed April's murder. He had worked various jobs over the years, but had never been arrested for any serious crimes that would have resulted in his DNA being entered into criminal databases. Miller's employment history showed that he had worked for local businesses and had access to vehicles that would have allowed him to move freely throughout the Fort Wayne area. His familiarity with the area was extensive, as he had lived there his entire life and would have known both the urban neighborhoods and rural roads that were relevant to April's case. This local knowledge explained how the killer had been able to abduct April from her neighborhood and transport her body to a remote location without being detected. The genetic genealogy investigation had taken approximately 6 weeks from start to finish, representing an extraordinary success for the technique and demonstrating how effective it could be when applied to cases with good DNA evidence and suitable genetic matches. The speed of the solution was particularly remarkable, given that traditional investigative methods had failed to identify the killer despite 30 years of effort and the availability of his DNA profile for more than a decade. The success of genetic genealogy in April's case was due to several factors that had come together perfectly. The DNA evidence was high quality and came from multiple sources. The genetic matches in public databases were suitable for building comprehensive family trees. The historical records for Midwest families were well documented and accessible, and the killer's long-term residence in the Fort Wayne area made it possible to identify him through local genealogical research. The collaboration between C.C. Moore and Fort Wayne investigators was also crucial to the success of the case. Moore's genealogical expertise, combined with the investigators' knowledge of the case and their behavioral analysis of the killer, created a powerful partnership that was able to identify the correct suspect within a remarkably short time period. On July 15, 2018, Fort Wayne police officers arrived at John D. Miller's home in Grable to conduct what they described as a welfare check, hoping to find an opportunity to collect a DNA sample that could confirm or eliminate him as a suspect. Miller came to the door and spoke with the officers, but before they could even explain why they were there, he said something that immediately confirmed what genetic genealogy had predicted. When Miller opened his door and saw police officers standing there, he looked at them and said just one word: April Tinsley. The officers were shocked by his immediate acknowledgement of the case, as they had not mentioned April's name or given any indication of why they were at his home. Miller's spontaneous reference to April suggested that he had been expecting this moment for 30 years and knew exactly why police had finally come to his door. Miller was taken into custody for questioning, and investigators obtained a search warrant for his home and property. During the search, They collected DNA evidence that could be compared to the profile from April's case. Laboratory analysis confirmed what genetic genealogy had predicted: John D. Miller's DNA was a perfect match to the genetic evidence from both April's murder and the taunting messages that had terrorized Fort Wayne for 16 years. Miller initially denied involvement in April's murder during police interviews, but the DNA evidence was overwhelming and incontrovertible. He eventually confessed to kidnapping, sexually assaulting, and murdering April Tinsley, as well as to leaving the taunting messages that had kept the case in the public consciousness for so many years. He provided details about the crime that only the killer would have known, confirming that genetic genealogy had identified the correct perpetrator. The confession revealed that Miller had spotted April walking home from her friend's house on April 4th, 1988, and had offered her a ride. When she accepted, he had driven her to a secluded location where he sexually assaulted and killed her. He had then transported her body to the rural ditch where it was found 3 days later. Miller admitted that he had kept one of April's shoes as a trophy, which explained his references to the missing shoe in his taunting messages. Miller also confessed to the years of taunting that had followed April's murder. He said that he had enjoyed the attention that his messages received and the fear they created in the community. He had felt safe from detection and had believed that he would never be caught, which had made him bold enough to continue his psychological campaign for 16 years. The 2004 packages had been his most brazen act, designed to terrorize new victims and prove to investigators that he was still active and still beyond their reach. The arrest and confession provided closure to April Tinsley's family, who had waited 30 years for justice. Janet Tinsley, April's mother, had never stopped fighting for her daughter and had maintained hope that the case would someday be solved. The genetic genealogy breakthrough meant that she finally had answers about who had killed April and why he had continued to torture the family and community with his taunting messages. The case also provided validation for genetic genealogy as a revolutionary tool for solving cold cases. April Tinsley's case demonstrated how quickly the technique could work when all the elements came together properly. High-quality DNA evidence, suitable genetic matches in public databases, and skilled genealogists who could build accurate family trees. The 6-week timeline from start to finish was extraordinary and showed that genetic genealogy could solve cases that had stumped investigators for decades. Miller was charged with murder, child molesting, and criminal confinement in connection with April's death. He pleaded guilty to the charges and was sentenced to 80 years in prison, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars for his crimes. The plea agreement spared April's family the trauma of a lengthy trial, while guaranteeing that Miller would never be released from prison. The April Tinsley case became one of the most prominent early successes of genetic genealogy, demonstrating the technique's potential and helping to establish it as a standard tool for cold case investigation. The case was widely covered in the media and helped to educate the public about how genetic genealogy worked and why it was so effective for identifying unknown perpetrators. The success of April's case led to increased demand for genetic genealogy services from law enforcement agencies across the country. Parabon Nanolabs and other companies began working on dozens of additional cases, and the technique rapidly expanded beyond its initial applications. The April Tinsley case provided a template for how genetic genealogy investigations should be conducted and demonstrated the importance of having both high-quality DNA evidence and skilled genealogical researchers. The case also highlighted the psychological aspects of serial criminals who taunt law enforcement and communities. Miller's 16 years of messages and threats represented an unusual pattern of behavior that was both psychologically revealing and ultimately self-destructive. His compulsive need to maintain contact with investigators and to terrorize the community with reminders of his crime had provided exactly the evidence that investigators needed to catch him. Miller's own DNA, left behind in the 2004 packages, had been the key to solving April's case through genetic genealogy. His arrogance and compulsive behavior had led him to provide investigators with high-quality evidence that could be analyzed using techniques that weren't available when he first committed his crime. In trying to prove that he was untouchable, he had actually given investigators everything they needed to identify and arrest him. The April Tinsley case demonstrated several important principles about genetic genealogy and cold case investigation. First, it showed that the technique could work very quickly when conditions were favorable. Second, it proved that genetic genealogy was not limited to cases that were decades old, but could also be effective on more recent crimes that had good DNA evidence. Third, it highlighted the importance of preserving DNA evidence from unsolved crimes, even when it couldn't be analyzed using contemporary techniques. The case also showed how genetic genealogy could provide closure to victims' families who had waited decades for answers. April Tinsley's case had been one of Fort Wayne's most notorious unsolved crimes, and its resolution provided emotional relief to both the family and the broader community. The technique offered hope to other families who were still waiting for justice in their own cases. The success of genetic genealogy in April's case contributed to a broader transformation in how law enforcement approached cold cases. Agencies began reviewing their unsolved cases to identify which ones might be suitable for genetic genealogy analysis, and many began allocating resources specifically for these investigations. The technique represented a new tool that could breathe life into investigations that had been dormant for years or decades. The April Tinsley case also demonstrated the importance of public genealogy databases and the willingness of ordinary citizens to contribute their genetic information for family history research. The genetic matches that had made Miller's identification possible came from distant relatives who had submitted their DNA to genealogy companies for legitimate family history purposes. Their participation in genealogy research had inadvertently provided the key to solving April's murder. However, the case also raised questions about privacy and consent that continue to be debated as genetic genealogy becomes more widespread. The genetic matches that led to Miller's identification came from people who had submitted their DNA for family history research, not for criminal investigation. While most people support using genetic information to solve serious crimes like child murder, there are legitimate concerns about how this information might be used in the future and what protections exist to prevent misuse. The legal framework for genetic genealogy was still evolving when April's case was solved, and the technique's success in high-profile cases like hers helped to establish precedents for its use in criminal investigation. Courts generally found that genetic genealogy was legally permissible as long as proper procedures were followed and traditional DNA confirmation was obtained before arrests were made. The April Tinsley case represented a perfect storm of factors that made genetic genealogy extraordinarily successful. High-quality DNA evidence, suitable genetic matches, skilled genealogical researchers, and a perpetrator whose own behavior had provided investigators with exactly what they needed to solve the case. The combination of these factors resulted in one of the fastest and most dramatic successes in the early history of genetic genealogy. Miller's 16 years of taunting had been designed to prove that he was smarter than law enforcement, and that he would never be caught. Instead, his messages had kept April's case in the public consciousness, maintained investigative interest in solving it, and provided fresh DNA evidence that could be analyzed using advancing technology. His arrogance had been his downfall, and his own DNA had been the evidence that finally brought him to justice. The April Tinsley case showed that no criminal is beyond the reach of advancing science, and that time and technology can combine to solve even the most challenging cases. Miller had thought he was safe after 30 years, but genetic genealogy had reached back across 3 decades to identify him and hold him accountable for his crimes. The case proved that justice can prevail even when traditional methods have been exhausted, and that new techniques can provide answers that seemed impossible to obtain. April Tinsley's case became a symbol of how genetic genealogy could revolutionize criminal investigation and provide justice to victims who had been forgotten by everyone except their families. The 8-year-old girl whose life was cut short in 1988 had finally received justice in 2018, and her killer's own arrogance had been the key to his capture. The case demonstrated that genetic genealogy was not just a forensic technique, but a tool for healing communities and providing closure to families who had never stopped hoping for answers. The success of genetic genealogy in April's case contributed to its rapid adoption by law enforcement agencies across the United States and around the world. The technique that had begun with the Golden State Killer was quickly being applied to hundreds of other cases, with success rates that far exceeded traditional cold case methods. April Tinsley's case had helped prove that genetic genealogy was not a one-time breakthrough, but a revolutionary approach that could be applied systematically to solve cold cases. Looking back on April Tinsley's case, it's clear that Miller's taunting behavior was both his signature and his undoing. His compulsive need to maintain contact with investigators and terrorize the community had provided exactly the evidence needed for genetic genealogy to work. Without the 2004 DNA evidence from his packages, the case might have remained unsolved even after genetic genealogy became available. His arrogance had been his greatest mistake and the key to his eventual capture. The April Tinsley case will be remembered as one of the most dramatic early successes of genetic genealogy, demonstrating how quickly the technique could work when all the elements came together perfectly. More importantly, it will be remembered as the case that finally provided justice for an 8-year-old girl whose killer thought he was untouchable and who spent 16 years proving that he was wrong. April Tinsley's case showed that no matter how arrogant criminals become, science and determination can ultimately prevail, and that justice may be delayed but never defeated when investigators refuse to give up hope. Thank you for watching this investigation into how a killer's own arrogance led to his downfall and how genetic genealogy revolutionized cold case investigation. If you believe that criminals who taunt law enforcement deserve to be caught by their own evidence, subscribe to the Investigation Room right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into cases where advancing science finally brings justice to victims who deserve answers. Share this video with anyone who wants to understand how genetic genealogy is solving cases that seemed impossible just a few years ago. And let me know in the comments what you think about cases where killers become so arrogant that they provide the very evidence needed for their own capture. The April Tinsley case proves that genetic genealogy can work incredibly quickly when the conditions are right, and that no killer can hide forever when science advances enough to reach back across decades and identify them through family connections they never knew existed.